The morning started just like any other. My coffee was steaming in the company mug they'd given me for my 10-year anniversary. The familiar hum of the servers in the background was like a steady heartbeat. That floor, my floor, I knew every inch of it. Id helped design the workflow for the compliance department. My signature was on half the foundational documents in the digital archive. I wasn't just an employee, I was a part of the architecture. I had certifications that took years to earn, clearances that required intense scrutiny. I thought that loyalty was a two-way street. I was wrong. AS 9100 certification, he didn't have the security clearance Id maintained for a decade. The restructuring was a lie. It was a cost-cutting measure. They'd found a cheaper model and swapped me out without a second thought. I went to my filing cabinet. My hands were shaking. I pulled out the large portfolio, where I kept everything related to the series. It was all there, the very first thumbnail sketch of Vein of Memory, on a napkin dated over 2 years ago, dozens of progress photos, on my phone timestamped, showing the canvas evolving from a blank slate to its finished state. And the email, so many emails to Julian himself, sent late at night, talking about my struggles, with a particular layer asking his opinion. Color, I was building a timeline, a mountain of proof, with every piece of paper I touched. And then at the very bottom of the folder, I found it, the certificate of authenticity. Id had them printed on heavy watermarked paper early on a professional practice. Id adopted. Each one was numbered with the title of the work, its dimensions, the materials used, and my signature. I had one for every piece in the series. I had never given them to Julian. They were sitting right here, worthless, until this very moment. I scanned everything and sent it to Dr. Vance. I didn't hear back for 2 days. They were the longest 48 hours of my life. Then an email arrived. It was brief and to the point. It requested a meeting at the museum with me and my lawyer present. Julian had also been summoned. The meeting was in a stark, quiet conference room. Julian arrived first. He wouldn't look at me. He looked smaller than I remembered, stripped of his confidence. Dr. Vance and the museum's head of acquisitions were there, their expressions unreadable. My lawyer sat beside me, a steadying presence. Dr. Vance didn't waste time. She laid the evidence out on the table. Literally, she had prints of my emails, my photos, a copy of the certificate. She turned to Julian and said, "Mr. Croft, the museum cannot proceed with this acquisition without a verifiable provenance. The evidence presented by the artist is compelling and complete. Can you provide any documentation to substantiate your authorship of this work?" Julian stared at the table. His face was pale. He tried to stammer something about collaborative energy, about conceptual guidance, but his words sounded hollow and pathetic in the face of my dated physical proof. The truth was in the timeline, in the fingerprints of my process, that he could never replicate. There was no fight left in him. The facade crumbled completely. He just shook his head. The museum's decision was swift. They issued a public statement, retracting the acquisition offer. They corrected the record, naming me as the sole creator of the Erosion series. The art world, which had celebrated Julian, now turned on him. With the same ferocity, articles were written about plagiarism in the contemporary art scene. His gallery dropped him. He became a pariah. The victory was quiet. There was no big celebration. The betrayal still stung, a deep ache that I knew would take a long time to fade. But something had shifted. I went back to my studio. The blank canvas didn't look so intimidating anymore. I had my name back. My work was finally unequivocally mine. The museum didn't acquire the piece, but that almost didn't matter. They had authenticated something far more important than a painting. They had authenticated the truth, and I realized that no amount of stolen acclaim can ever build a real legacy. A legacy has to be built on something authentic, something that can't be faked, because it's rooted in the truth of your own hands. That phone call was the pivot. The hurt curdled into a cold, hard anger. It was the fuel I needed. I stopped looking for another job and decided to build my own. I leveraged every contact, every bit of that specialized knowledge they'd thrown away. I started a consulting firm. My home office became my command center. The first contract was small, then another. I found I was good at being my own boss. The freedom was intoxicating. The work was more fulfilling because it was mine. I was building something on. The first time I saw you, you were a bundle of raw talent, all nervous energy and big ideas, standing in the corner at that industry mixer, looking completely lost. I remember thinking you had the spark, the kind of hunger you can't teach. So I walked over, introduced myself, and bought you a drink. You couldn't believe I was talking to you. You kept stammering, saying how much you admired my work, that you'd studied my projects in school. That was the beginning. I brought you into the fold, gave you a seat at the table on the Henderson account. Even though you were far too junior for it, I sat with you for hours late into the night, breaking down the complexities of client management. I showed you the unspoken rules, the art of the deal beyond the numbers. I introduced you to everyone, my contacts, became your contacts, my trust in you became your credibility. And you learned fast, incredibly fast. You absorbed everything I threw at you. At first it was flattering. I felt like a proud parent watching a child excel. But then the gratitude started to fade from your eyes, replaced by something else, a quiet calculation. You started speaking up in meetings. Before I could finishing my sentences, with a sharper, more aggressive point, you'd present our collaborative work. As if the best ideas were solely yours, I noticed the little things, the way you'd CC the senior partners on emails that should have just been between us, positioning yourself as the point of origin. You were building your own empire brick by brick, using my materials. I saw it happening, but a part of me refused to believe it. Id built this department from nothing. My name was on the door, figuratively speaking. I thought my position was unshakable. I thought loyalty was a currency that still held value. I was wrong. Then came the reorg, the big strategic shift the board had been whispering about. For months, new leadership structure, streamlining, all that corporate jargon. You saw your chance. I didn't realize it was a campaign. Until it was almost over. The subtle comments you'd drop in meetings with the executives, the way you'd reframe my careful, proven strategies. As old guard and risk-averse, you positioned yourself as the future, dynamic, innovative, hungry. You made my experience look like a liability. The meeting with HR was brief. They called it a transition, an opportunity for me to take an advisory role, which is a fancy term for being put out to pasture. They offered a generous early retirement package. It was a velvet-lined box. They said the company needed to move in a new direction, and that my protégé were the right person to lead that charge. The betrayal wasn't in the loss of the title. It was in the silence that followed. You never called, you never came to my office to explain, to apologize, to even acknowledge what you had done. The person I had invested in, the career I had nurtured, just turned its back and walked away. The hurt was a physical thing, a cold stone in my gut. It felt less like a corporate maneuver and more like a divorce. For months, I tried to disconnect. I traveled, I worked on my garden. I told myself I was better off without the stress. But the industry is a small world. I'd hear things. That your leadership was chaotic. That you were pushing too hard, too fast, trying to prove yourself. You were dismantling my legacy piece by piece, calling it innovation. Then the news broke. The Viridian project, the one you'd taken over and completely overhauled with your new vision. It had blown up catastrophically, a fundamental flaw in the execution. Something a more experienced eye would have caught immediately. The clients were furious. There were threats of lawsuits, the company's stock price took a hit, and your name was plastered all over. The disaster, the very ambition you used to push me out, was now burning your own house down. My own terms, and slowly the shame of that silent walkout was replaced by a quiet, steady pride. My phone started ringing, old colleagues muttering about the mess. I didn't answer, I just watched from a distance. There was a part of me, I won't lie, that felt a grim satisfaction, a sense of justice. You had made your bed. But then you called. Your voice on my voicemail was different. The confidence was gone, replaced by a strained, thin sound. You asked to meet in person. I almost deleted it, but curiosity, or maybe something else, made me agree. We met at a coffee shop far from the office. You looked tired, worn thin. You didn't waste time with small talk. You laid it out. The Viridian collapse was worse than the rumors. It was an existential threat to the company. And there was a clause, a safety net built into the original contract years ago, a clause you'd probably considered an antiquated formality for the project to be legally dissolved without a massive penalty. It required the sign-off of the original architect of record, my signature, my professional seal. The very thing you had rendered obsolete was the only thing that could save you, save your job, your reputation, everything. You had to sit there in front of the man you'd betrayed and ask for my name to clean up your mess. The humiliation was palpable. You couldn't even look me in the eye. You just stared at your hands, talking about the team, the investors, trying to frame it as a plea for the greater good. But we both knew it was a plea for you. And that's when the real choice presented itself. It wasn't a simple yes or no, it was a fork in the road for my own soul. The easy path was justice to say no, to let you drown in the consequences of your own actions, to watch, as the ambition you wielded so ruthlessly finally consumed you. It's what you deserved, it's what the angry, wounded part of me wanted to see. But then I thought about what it means to be a mentor really means. It's not just about teaching someone how to do the job, it's about teaching them how to be a professional, how to have integrity. I had failed in that second part. I had created a brilliant strategist, but I had not created a person of character. Was my legacy really just about the projects I completed? Or was it about the standards I upheld? If I walked away now, if I let you fail completely, what did that say about the value of the guidance I had offered? That it was conditional, that it could be withdrawn when I was hurt. To sign would be an act of grace you in no way deserved. It would be saving you from the very disaster you orchestrated. It would be the ultimate lesson in professionalism, when you hadn't learned from all our late nights that sometimes the strongest move isn't to crush your opponent, but to rise above the petty desire for revenge, that the mark of a true leader isn't how high you climb, but how you handle yourself when you have absolute power over someone else's fate. But to refuse would be a lesson too, a harsher one. It would teach you about cause and effect. It would be a brutal education in the fact that actions have consequences that can't always be smoothed over by talent or ambition. It would be a lesson in justice, cold, hard, and deserved. Almost 8 months to the day after I was escorted out of the building, my personal phone rang. The number wasn't saved, but I recognized the prefix. It was the company's main switchboard. I let it go to voicemail. An hour later, an email arrived from David's executive assistant, marked urgent. Then another call, this time from a number I did know. It was David's direct line. The power dynamic had already shifted. With that first missed call, I waited until the next morning to call him back. I looked at you sitting there waiting for my verdict, your future entirely in my hands. And I thought about the young, eager person I'd met all those years ago, the one with the spark. I realized the betrayal wasn't just yours. It was mine too. I saw the ambition, and I fed it, but I didn't temper it with wisdom. I didn't instill the humility that should accompany talent. I created the monster that then turned on me. So my decision isn't really about you, it's about me. It's about what I want my professional life to have meant. Do I want to be remembered as the man who got even, or as the man who, even when wounded, understood that the work itself, the integrity of the project, the stability of the team that still depended on it, was bigger than our personal conflict? I will sign the paperwork. I will add my signature, the one you worked so hard to make irrelevant to save your career. But I will also write a letter, a detailed, unflinching letter to the board outlining exactly what went wrong on the Veridian project from a technical standpoint. It will be a clinical analysis. But between the lines, it will be a lesson. It will be my final act of mentorship. I am giving you a second chance you don't deserve. But I am also making sure you and everyone else understands precisely why you needed one. The grace is in the signature. The justice is in the truth that accompanies it. That is the weight of being a mentor. It's a responsibility that doesn't end just because the pupil has chosen to forget their teacher. The town of Cedar Bluff wasn't just a dot on the map for me. It was my life's work. For 22 years I was the city planner. I knew every crack in the pavement on Maple Street, the way the old oaks on the courthouse lawn would cast their shade at 3 in the afternoon, the exact spot where the creek would flood if we got more than 2 inches of rain in an hour. It was my job to know these things. But it was more than a job, it was a responsibility, a stewardship. My big project, the one I'd been nursing for almost 5 years, was the Riverwalk Grant. It was a state-funded initiative to revitalize the old industrial sector along the Cedar River. We're talking about turning a dilapidated, overgrown stretch of riverbank into a beautiful public spacewalking trails, a new playground, a pavilion for concerts, small business incubators in the old brick warehouses. It was a vision, a way to give the town a real heart again, a place for people to gather, for kids play safely, for new life to bloom. I'd spent countless hours on the application, the demographics, the environmental impact studies, the 5-year economic projections. It was all there, airtight. I was proud of it. It felt like my legacy. But there was a faction on the town council, led by Mayor Evans, that never saw it that way. To them, it was a vanity project, a waste of taxpayer money. Even though the grant would cover 90% of the cost, they called it frivolous. They said I was out of touch with the town's real needs, which in their view were just lower taxes and simpler solutions. The whispers started at the grocery store after church services. They'd say I was inefficient, that I was planning for some future version of the town that nobody wanted. They positioned themselves as the fiscally responsible ones, the guardians of the town's purse strings. It was a clever smear campaign. They weren't just disagreeing with my ideas. They were questioning my commitment to the community I'd served for decades. The vote to terminate my contract came as a shock, even though I should have seen it coming. They used a minor budgetary oversight from the previous quarter as their pretext, a paperwork delay, something that had happened a dozen times before without consequence. But this time, it was different. Mayor Evans made a speech about accountability and a new direction. The vote was narrow, 4-3, just like that. 22 years ended the silence in the council chamber after the gavel came down was deafening. A few. His voice was strained, a thin layer of forced calm over what sounded like pure panic. "We have a situation," he said, skipping the hello, "a major one, the federal audit for the Horizon project. It's happening next week." Out of the blue, people stood up and objected, called it a disgrace. But others, they just sat there. Some even nodded in agreement. The town was divided right down the middle. I packed my office quietly, the maps on the wall, the rolled-up blueprints, the little model of the proposed Riverwalk that the high school shop class had made for me. It all went into boxes. The feeling wasn't just anger, it was a deep, profound disillusionment. I felt unappreciated, discarded. I went home and tried to settle into a private life. I started gardening more. I took long walks, but my route always seemed to end up along the river, looking at that neglected stretch of land, seeing the potential that was now slipping away. I heard through the grapevine that the new council was reviewing the grant application that was code for dismantling it. They were going to strip out the park elements, the public spaces, and try to repurpose the funds for something smaller, something that fit their narrower vision. They were going to let my dream project die a death by 1,000 cuts. Then, about 3 months after I was fired, my phone started ringing. It was people from the town clerk's office, folks I'd worked with for years. They were nervous, hesitant. They said the state grant agency had been in touch. There was a problem, a big problem. It turned out that the original application, the one I had meticulously prepared and certified as a licensed professional, had a specific clause buried in the fine print. The final authorization signature, the one that legally binds the town to the project's specifications, had to come from the certified planner who drafted the submission. That was me. Their altered application was worthless without my signature, and the absolute deadline for submission was 5 days away. The mayor's office tried to pressure the state to argue that a new signature from their hired consultant should suffice. The state's response was a flat bureaucratic no. The rules were the rules. The integrity of the application process was tied to the original certifying professional. The council was in a panic. The entire project, the very funding they had claimed was a low priority, was now on the line, and they were about to lose it because of a technicality they had created by firing me. The call finally came. It was Mayor Evans himself. His voice was strained, too cheerful, like he was trying to sell me a used car. He asked if I could come down to his office for a chat. Said it was important. I knew exactly what it was about. I told him I was busy. I said he could come to my house if it was so urgent. He showed up an hour later with Councilwoman Miller, one of his staunchest allies. They sat on my porch, looking uncomfortable in the wicker chairs. Evans did all the talking. He tried to frame it as a simple administrative hurdle, a little bit of red tape. They needed my help to cut. He talked about the project in the vaguest terms, never acknowledging that it was my project, the one he had campaigned against. He didn't apologize. He didn't admit they were wrong. He just asked, in this roundabout way, if I would please sign the form. I let the silence hang in the air for a long moment. I looked past them toward the town. I could see the church spire downtown. I thought about the kids who needed a safe place to play by the river. I thought about the small business owners who were counting on that revitalization. This wasn't about Evans or Miller or their political games. This was about Cedar Bluff. This was about the people who lived here. The Horizon Project, my project, I'd shepherded it from a proposal to a fully developed program. I knew its every detail, every potential weakness. I had all the leverage in that moment. I could have said no. I could have watched them squirm. I could have demanded my job back, a public apology. Anything. The desire to see them humiliated was a real hot feeling in my chest. But then I thought about what that would make me, just another player in their petty game, another person putting pride before people. So I looked at Mayor Evans, and I said I'll sign the form. His shoulders slumped with visible relief. But I wasn't finished on one condition. I said you submit the application exactly as I wrote it, not a comma change, the full Riverwalk. Project, the park, the trails, the pavilion, all of it. That's the vision the town supported, that's the project I certified. You get your consultant to write a letter guaranteeing that. Evans and Miller exchanged a look. They knew they had no choice. They agreed. I went inside, printed the form from the state website, and I signed my name right there on my kitchen table. I handed it to Evans. He took it like it was a precious artifact. As they were leaving, I said one last thing. Remember, you're not doing this for me. You're not even doing it for yourselves. You're doing it for them. I gestured toward the town. This signature isn't for the council, it's for the community. They left without another word. I stood on my porch and watched them go. I didn't feel triumphant. I felt resolved. I had risen above the pettiness in that moment. I was still the city planner for Cedar Bluff. Whether I had the title or not, I had acted as a true servant of the community. And in doing so, I had reclaimed a part of myself that their vote had tried to take away. The project would go forward, the town would get its heart. And that was the only victory that mattered. The office was always too quiet, not a peaceful quiet, but the kind that feels heavy like the air itself is holding its breath. You get used to the sound of your own keyboard, the slow turn of a page, in a centurisal text. My corner of the humanities building was a world away from the buzz down the hall, where the new digital media folks had their glass-walled labs and constant chattering student traffic. Their work-generated headlines attracted big grants, mine generated dust. I was deep into a philological study of a specific, almost forgotten dialectical shift in late medieval merchant logs. It wasn't sexy, it wasn't fast, it was meticulous, painstaking work. Building a thesis, one fragile handwritten word at a time. I loved it. It felt like archaeology for language. But love doesn't pay the bills in a modern university. The department meetings were the worst, sitting around that polished table listening to colleagues strategize about impact factors and public engagement. I'd try to talk about my findings, about how this slow, careful work was foundational, that it provided a crucial granular understanding of how culture actually moves, not in broad strokes, but in the tiny daily exchanges of ordinary people. The nods I'd get were polite, dismissive. My course enrollments dwindled. First they cut my advanced seminar, then they moved my survey course to an 8 a.m. slot. I became a ghost in my own department, a relic from a time when scholarship was allowed to be slow. The day the letter came, it wasn't even a surprise. The department chair, a man I'd shared coffee with for a decade, couldn't quite meet my eyes' shifting academic priorities. He said, reading from a script, I am sure someone in the dean's office had written a strategic realignment of resources. The official reason was a lack of extramural funding. My contract wouldn't be renewed. My life's work, the boxes of note cards, the digital archives I'd built by hand, the half-finished manuscript, it was all deemed non-essential. David continued his words, tumbling out. The lead auditor is asking for the final certification of compliance. The Form D, it has to be signed by the original qualifying manager. That's your digital signature, is the only one the system will accept. Without it, the entire project is non-compliant. We're looking at 7-figure fines, a complete work stoppage. It could sink the division. Remember, the feeling wasn't anger, not at first. It was a hollow coldness, like I'd been standing on ice I thought was solid, and it had just given way beneath me. Packing my office was a peculiar kind of grief. 20 years. The book smelled familiar, like home. Each folder was a memory of a discovery, a late night, a connection made across time. I boxed it all up, every last note card. The new hire, a bright young thing studying internet memes, needed the space. I took the boxes home to my small study. The university had let me go, but the work hadn't. I couldn't abandon it. So I kept going without the library access, without the title, without a salary. I spent my savings on journal subscriptions I wrote in the early mornings before my part-time adjunct work at a community college. It was a lonely, grinding existence, but the work itself was a constant. It was the one thing they couldn't take from me. Then, after 2 years of this quiet exile, I finally finished the manuscript. I sent it to a small, highly respected university, press, the kind that still valued monographs. I didn't expect much, but the response was electric. The peer reviews were glowing. They called it a masterpiece of meticulous scholarship. a foundational text that recontextualizes our understanding of pre-modern economic communication. It got a long featured review in one of the top journals in the field. Email inbox, which had been silent for so long, started filling up invitations to speak at conferences. I could never afford to attend requests for interviews. My phone, the same number id had for 20 years, started ringing with calls from scholars at Oxford, from Heidelberg. Everyone was talking about it, everyone, that is, except my former university id. Check their news page. Nothing. It was a vindication that echoed everywhere, but in the one place that had deemed my work worthless. The call came on a Tuesday afternoon. The caller ID showed the university's main switchboard. I almost didn't answer. I thought it might be a survey, but something made me pick up. It was the dean's assistant, not the department chair, but the dean himself. She asked if I had a moment to speak with him. There was a new deferential tone in her voice. I said I did. When he came on the line, there was a long pause. I could hear him choosing his words with immense care. I trust you're well, he began the formality. Brittle. I am calling. Well, the university is in a rather sensitive situation. Our department is undergoing its decennial accreditation review. He explained it in broad bureaucratic terms. The External Review Board had just completed its initial site visit. Their preliminary report was, in his words, concerning the specific area of concern they had flagged was a critical lack of depth in historical linguistics and traditional philological methodology. They noted that the department's current trajectory was entirely focused on contemporary theory, leaving a gaping hole in its foundational offerings. The exact words from the report which he read to me were a serious deficiency in the area of diachronic textual analysis undermines the department's claim to comprehensive excellence. There was another pause. Longer this time. I said nothing. I just listened to the hum of the line. The accreditation board, he continued, his voice tightening, has made an unusual stipulation for the final review to be favorable. They are requiring a supplemental peer review. They want an external evaluation of the department's curriculum and faculty expertise. Specifically in this area of weakness. He cleared his throat. And they have specifically requested that the review be conducted by the leading authority in the field. They've asked for you. There it was, the moment of pure unadulterated irony. They had replaced me to save money, and now their survival depended on a signature they had rendered invalid by firing the only person authorized to give it. I felt a surge of vindication, so sharp it was almost painful, but right behind it was the old hurt, the memory of that cold room and averted eyes. The silence that followed was the most profound I have ever experienced. I could hear the weight of his humiliation, the sheer staggering irony of the situation, pressing down on him through the phone. The department that had cast me out for my irrelevant work now needed my signature on a report to save itself from being stripped of its accreditation. My name, my expertise, which they had dismissed as a financial liability, was now the only thing standing between them and utter professional disgrace. We would of course compensate you for your time, he said quickly, at the standard consultant rate, and we would need the report within 60 days. He was trying to make it sound like a business transaction, but the plea was naked in his voice. I told him I would need to see the full preliminary report from the accreditation board, the department's current 5-year plan, all the course syllabi, and the CVs of every faculty member. I said I would conduct a full and independent review. My tone was flat. Professional. I gave him nothing. I said I'd be in touch. The package arrived by courier. The next day it was thick. I spread the documents out on my dining room table, the same table where I'd written the book that had saved my career. I read every word. The accreditation board's report was brutal in its clinical assessment. The department's own strategic plan was a monument to short-term thinking, full of buzzwords and empty metrics. As I pored over the course descriptions, I saw the ghost of my own work, the holes where my seminars used to be. I saw the thinness, lack of intellectual rigor. It was all surface. My former colleagues' CVs were packed with publications in trendy journals, but when you looked closely, the work was repetitive, derivative. There was no foundation. They were building a house on sand, and the inspectors had finally noticed. For a week I lived inside those documents. I took notes. I compared the course offerings to those at peer institutions. I assessed the faculty's research output with a cold, dispassionate eye. The power I held was immense, and I felt its gravity. I could write a report that would sink them. I could detail every flaw, every instance of intellectual neglect, and recommend that accreditation be denied. It would be a kind of justice, a perfect poetic revenge. The thought was tempting. I imagined the look on the chair's face. But as I worked, a different feeling began to surface, one that was quieter and more stubborn. It wasn't about them anymore. It was about the students, it was about the discipline itself. I thought about the graduate students who would be left in the lurch if the department lost its standing. I thought about the importance of the work, the real substantive knowledge that was being lost in the chase for relevance. Revenge would have been satisfying, but it would also have been an admission that I was as small-minded as they were, that my scholarship, which was about seeking truth, no matter how inconvenient, could be bent for a petty personal victory. I wrote the report. It was 30 pages long. It was unsparing in its criticism. I documented the lack of historical depth, the overreliance on theory, without a grounding in primary texts, the failure to maintain a diverse and robust curriculum. I called the strategic plan unfit for purpose. I stated plainly that the department in its current form did not meet the standards for accreditation. But in the final section, I didn't just condemn them, I laid out a path forward, a detailed 5-year remediation plan. It involved reinstituting core courses in historical linguistics and textual criticism. It recommended a new hire, a tenure-track position dedicated to this foundational work. It suggested a mandatory faculty development program to reintegrate these methodologies into their teaching. My final recommendation was for conditional accreditation contingent on the full implementation of this plan. It was the hardest thing I've ever written. It was a verdict, but it was. I let the silence on the line stretch out. I could hear him breathing, waiting. I see, I said, my voice, even that is a situation. Also a blueprint. It was the report the department needed, not the one it deserved. I emailed it to the dean. I didn't hear back for days. Then, a simple acknowledgement received, thank you. Months later, I saw the announcement on the university website. The department had received its accreditation, with conditions. A new job listing was posted shortly after that. The title was Assistant Professor of Historical Linguistics and Archival Studies. The description mirrored the recommendations in my report, almost word for word. I sometimes wonder if they ever knew that the path I gave them was the very one they had rejected when they let me go. The vindication wasn't in the power I held over them. It was in the integrity of the work itself. The slow, meticulous, unfashionable research they had discarded turned out to be the very pillar that held up the roof. They needed me to point out that the foundation was crumbling, and in doing so, I didn't just save their department. I proved once and for all that some truths are not disposable. They are essential, and they have a way of waiting patiently for their moment to be heard. We need you to come in and sign it, he pleaded, the professional facade cracking. Today will compensate you for your time, of course. The email from HR popped up at 9:05 a.m. Please come to conference room B at 9:15. No subject, no context, just a time and a place. I remember feeling a flicker of curiosity. Nothing more. Maybe it was about the new compliance software I'd been recommending. I finished my coffee, straightened my tie, and walked down the hallway, nodding to a few colleagues. They smiled back. Everything seemed normal. Compensate me? I asked David. Let's talk about what happened. Why was I really let go? Why was my role given to someone without the necessary credentials? I think I deserve some transparency before we talk about compensation. The silence on his end was deafening. I could practically hear him squirming. He stumbled through an explanation about budget reallocations, market pressures, a strategic pivot. It was the same corporate speak from the conference room. It had no power over me anymore. That's not an answer, David, I said calmly. That's a script. Let me be clear. I am no longer an employee. I am a consultant. My time, and more importantly, my signature, which you now acknowledge has significant value, are billable assets. I laid out my terms. My consulting rate was 5 times my old hourly salary. And for this specific service, given the urgency and the fact that my unique unreplaceable credential was required, there would be a separate substantial success fee, a number that would cover my daughter's entire college tuition. I wasn't just asking for money, I was asking for an admission of my worth. He agreed, of course. He agreed. They had no choice. I drove to the office. But this time, I wasn't holding a cardboard box. I was carrying my briefcase. I was given a temporary pass. I walked through the halls. And this time people made eye contact. They looked away quickly. But it was different. It wasn't pity. It was something closer to awe or maybe fear. I sat in David's office, not the sterile conference room. I logged into the system, pulled up the Form D, my fingers hovered over the keyboard. I looked at him. This signature ensures your survival. Remember that the next time you decide someone is easily replaceable. I clicked the button. The digital seal approved it. The deed was done. I sent the invoice that afternoon. The payment cleared within 24 hours. They never contacted me again. The lesson wasn't just about knowing your own value. It was about understanding that some things like integrity and specialized knowledge can't be bought at a discount. Their survival depended on a signature. But my survival, my real success, began the day I realized I never needed their building to have purpose. I built my own. JSON parse or network error, expecting value line 165 column, 1 char 902. The smell of that place is the first thing I remember. It wasn't just sawdust and varnish, it was the scent of my father's hands. I learned to count not with blocks, but by sorting nails in the back office. The business Henderson's Sons Fine Furniture. It wasn't just a company, it was our family's identity. My grandfather started it in his garage. My father built it into a local institution. And I was supposed to be the one who took it into the future. I knew every inch of that workshop, the specific groan of the floorboards near the big band, saw the way the morning light hit the stacks of maple and walnut. I didn't just learn the trade from my father, I absorbed it. He'd stand behind me, his hands guiding mine on the lathe, teaching me the feel of the wood. It was never about brute force, he'd say. It was about listening to the grain. It was our language. While my older brother David was more interested in the numbers on the spreadsheets, I was the one. But the air in conference room B was different. It was cold, sterile sitting. There was Sarah, the head of HR, and David, the senior VP I'd reported to. For 8 years David wouldn't meet my eyes. He was studying the grain of the wooden table. As if it held the secrets of the universe. Sarah's face was a polite professional mask. There were no pleasantries, just a thin folder on the table between us. Who could talk to a client about the intricacies of a dovetail joint? Who understood why a certain cut of cherry would warp if you didn't treat it just right? When Dad's health started to decline, it was a quiet, unspoken understanding that I would step up. David handled the books, and that was fine. But the vision, the soul of the place, that fell to me. I was the one who pushed us online, who started the custom commission side of things, that actually brought in a new younger clientele. I remember the look on Dad's face when I showed him our first major commission for a boutique hotel downtown. It was pride, it was validation. I was honoring the legacy while building something new. That's what I thought anyway. The tension with David was always there, just under the surface. He saw my ideas as frivolous, a distraction from the core business of building solid traditional pieces. He'd make comments about me being the artist, while he was the one keeping the lights on. It felt like jealousy. But I brushed it off. That's just how brothers are. Right then Dad passed. It was sudden, a heart attack. The grief was a physical weight on all of us. But in the middle of that fog, David moved. He called a family business meeting a week after the funeral. I thought it was to rally together, to plan how we'd honor Dad's memory by steering the ship together. I walked into the conference room, the same table Dad had built with his own hands, and I knew immediately something was wrong. David was there, our mother was there, and Uncle Phil, who's always been more of a silent partner. The air was thick. David slid a stack of papers across the table to me. I didn't understand the legal jargon at first. Restructuring, streamlining. Then I saw it. My title, Vice President of Operations, was gone. My shares, the 25% Dad had left to me, had been diluted down to a non-voting 5. I was being offered a consultancy role with a severance package if I signed a non-disclosure agreement. I looked at my mother. Her eyes were fixed on the grain of the tabletop, tracing a pattern with her finger. She wouldn't look at me. I felt the room tilt. What is this? I asked, my voice barely a whisper. David was calm, cold. He said the business needed a clear, singular direction, that my modernizations were too risky, that I was. And I remember the phrase exactly, not a good fit for the future he envisioned. It was a corporate coup, dressed up in family language. My own brother, my own mother sitting there. Silence, complicit. The exile was absolute. I was escorted out of the building that afternoon. My keycard didn't work. My email was deactivated. When I tried to call my mother, her calls went straight to voicemail. David sent a formal letter from the company lawyer instructing me not to contact any clients or employees. The family, the business, it was like a limb had been amputated. I'd see the Henderson Sons truck driving around town, and my stomach would clench. I'd hear about a family barbecue I wasn't invited to. We're restructuring the department. Sarah began, her voice flat without inflection. As a result, your position has been eliminated effective immediately. Through a mutual friend, the grief was a constant dull ache. I wasn't just mourning my father, I was mourning my entire life, my identity. I had poured my heart into that place, and they had treated me like a disloyal employee. 2 years passed. I started my own small design studio. It was a struggle, but it was mine. The anger hardened into a kind of numb acceptance. Then on a Tuesday morning, my phone rang. It was my mother. Her voice was thin, strange. She asked if we could meet, not at her house, not anywhere familiar, at a neutral coffee shop. I almost said no, but the sound of her voice, the sheer unusualness of the request, made me agree. She looked older, tired. She fumbled with her coffee cup, her hands shaking. She didn't make small talk. She just launched into it. A large corporate developer, the kind that buys up city blocks, had made an aggressive offer for the property our workshop stands on. It wasn't just an offer, it was a threat. They had dug up some old zoning technicality, something about the land use designation from the 1950s. They were challenging our right to operate a manufacturing business there. If they won, the business would be worthless, the land would be all that mattered. And then she said the words that changed everything. We need your signature, Michael. I just stared at her. She explained that when my grandfather first incorporated the business, he did it in a particular way. The land itself, the actual plot, was deeded not to the corporation, but to the Henderson family and their lineal descendants. It was an old-fashioned way of doing things, meant to keep the land in the family forever. When Dad died, his share of that deed passed to his heirs, me and David. For any major transaction involving the land, both signatures were required. David's signature alone was useless. My signature, the one attached to the person they'd thrown out, was the only thing standing between Henderson's sons and oblivion. She started to cry, then quiet, desperate tears. It wasn't just about the money, she pleaded. It was about my grandfather's legacy, the workshop he built with his hands, the memories of my father. She said David was too proud to call me himself, that he was trying to find another way, a legal loophole. But there wasn't one. It will all be gone, she whispered. Everything your father worked for, everything we are. I sat there listening to her, and I felt this cold, clear calm settle over me. For 2 years I had been powerless. I was the victim, the cast-out son. Now suddenly, I held all the power. The fate of the very thing they had prized above me was in my hands. I could save it, or I could let it die. The temptation to just walk away, to let their short-sightedness be their downfall, was immense. It would have been a kind of poetic justice. But I knew I couldn't, not for David, not even for my mother really, but for my grandfather, for my father, for the little boy who learned to count with nails in that back room. That legacy was mine too. They couldn't take that from me. I told my mother I wouldn't sign anything without a meeting, a real meeting, with David in the conference room at the table my father built. Walking back into that workshop was surreal. The smell was the same, the sounds were the same, but the eyes of the employees were different. They knew David was already at the table, his arms crossed. He looked exhausted, defeated. The arrogance was gone, replaced by a simmering resentment. I didn't sit down. I stood at the head of the table where Dad used to sit. The words didn't make sense at first. They were just sounds. Eliminated, restructuring. I looked at David, waiting for him to jump in, to say this was some sort of mistake, a bad joke. He just kept staring at that table. I asked for clarification. What did this mean? Was there another role? Sarah slid the folder toward me. It contained a severance agreement. The terms were fine, not generous, but acceptable. The unspoken message was clear: take this, and go quietly. I didn't yell. My voice was quiet, but it filled the room. I made him listen. I made him hear every bit of it: the betrayal, the cruelty of cutting me off from my own family, the injustice of taking the business I helped build and acting like I was a liability. I told him he was a coward who managed numbers, but had no vision, no understanding of what this place truly was. I said the business was failing, not because of some external threat, but because he had ripped its heart out when he got rid of me. He tried to interrupt, to defend himself, but I stopped him. I said, this isn't a negotiation, David, this is a reckoning. I laid out my terms. I would sign the deed on 2 conditions. First, my shares were to be restored to their original 25%, with full voting rights. Second, my name goes back on the door, not Henderson's sons, Henderson family, and I would have a seat on the board, a real voice in the direction of the company. He looked like been slapped. He argued, of course. He said it was unreasonable. But he had no leverage, the clock was ticking on their lawsuit. He finally grudgingly agreed, the lawyers were called, the papers were drawn up. I signed the deed, the business was saved, the legacy was preserved. But sitting there watching David sign his name next to mine, I felt no triumph, only a deep, profound sadness. The family, the real family, was broken. Maybe it was broken the day Dad died. And we just hadn't seen the cracks. We would be business partners, now tied together by legal documents and a shared history. But we weren't brothers, not anymore. The victory was in saving what my father built. But the cost was the understanding that some things once broken can never be truly glued back together. The wood remembers the crack. The funny thing about a government building, especially one like this, is the silence. It's not a peaceful quiet. It's a hum, the low, constant thrum of servers, of climate control, of a million tiny processes, working in perfect, unseen harmony. For 30 years, that hum was the soundtrack to my life. I knew every pitch, every subtle change in its tone. I could walk down a corridor and tell you if a cooling unit on the 3rd floor was about to fail just by the vibration coming through the floor tiles. My office was tucked away, no windows, just banks of monitors, showing the health of the network. Not the public network, mind you. This was the other one, the one that doesn't get a name, the one that moves information, that if it stopped moving would cause a very quiet, very profound kind of panic. I wasn't a director or a deputy assistant secretary. My title was technical specialist, grade 14. But what I really was a custodian, a caretaker. I knew that system like I knew the lines on my own hands. I'd written half its original code back when computers were the size of refrigerators. I'd nursed it through every upgrade, every new threat, every near miss. It was my life's work. And I believed in it. I believed that by keeping this one fragile thread of communication secure, I was serving something bigger than myself. It was a mission. Then the consultants arrived, men in suits that cost more than my monthly salary, with shiny shoes that clicked on the linoleum. They talked about efficiencies, about streamlining, about leveraging the private sector. They'd walk through our section, nodding, taking notes on their tablets. We joked about them, called them the efficiency experts. But there was a nervous edge to the laughter. I went to my director, a good man named Paul who'd been there almost as long as I had. I told him, Paul, this system, it's not just software. It's a living thing. It has quirks, it has a personality. You can't just hand a manual to some contractor who's never seen it before. He nodded, looking tired. He said, your expertise is invaluable, Sarah. They know that this is just about finding savings on paper. Don't worry. But I did worry. I could feel the tide turning. The language changed. We weren't dedicated civil servants anymore. We were legacy personnel. Our knowledge wasn't invaluable. It was tribal, a problem to be solved. The next hour was a blur of shame. They escorted me back to my desk, not to pack, but to watch as a security guard placed my personal items, a photo of my family, a spare sweater, a favorite pen, into a cardboard box. My keycard was deactivated before I even handed it over. The walk from my desk to the elevator was the longest of my life. I could feel the weight of a dozen pairs of eyes. But when I glanced up, everyone was suddenly very busy, heads down, screens, intensely fascinating. The silence was. Axe fell on a Tuesday, an all-hands meeting in the main auditorium. A deputy undersecretary I'd never met before stood at the podium, smiling a tight professional smile. He talked about a new era of partnership, about maximizing taxpayer value. Then, he said the words, our entire division was being phased out, our functions were being outsourced to a private contractor, OmniSec Solutions, who had submitted a bid that was, and he emphasized this, 20% lower than our operating budget. There was a gasp in the room. 20%. That was the price of our institutional memory, a 20% discount. The transition period was the most humiliating experience of my professional life. I was ordered to train my replacement. His name was Chad. He was 25, fresh out of a tech certification program, and he worked for OmniSec. He was polite, eager even. But he didn't understand. He kept asking for the standard operating procedure documents. I'd try to explain the nuances, the little fixes, the way the system would sometimes throw a specific error code that didn't mean what the manual said. It meant he'd just blink and say, but the protocol for error code 734B is clearly outlined in section 42. He couldn't grasp that the system was more than the sum of its protocols. My final day was a quiet affair. I boxed up 30 years of my life, a faded coffee mug, a few pictures of my family, A plant that had survived in the corner for a decade. I shook a few hands. People couldn't quite look me in the eye as I walked out for the last time. I passed Chad sitting at my desk in my chair, already on a call with his OmniSec project manager. The hum of the servers sounded different to me that day. It sounded indifferent. The months that followed were empty. I tried to enjoy retirement. I worked in the garden. I read books. But my mind was always there in that windowless room, worrying about the system. I'd wake up in the middle of the night, thinking about a potential vulnerability, a flaw in a recent patch that I hadn't had time to fully document. It was like I'd left a child behind. I followed the news, half expecting to hear about a catastrophic failure. But there was nothing, just silence. I started to think maybe I'd been wrong. Maybe the system was just a machine after all, and Chad, with his manuals, could keep it running just fine. The phone rang at 2:17 a.m. The sound was like a shard of glass in the deep silence of the house. I fumbled for it, my heart already pounding with that old familiar dread. The voice on the other end was strained high. With a panic it was trying very hard to suppress. Sarah, it's Paul, my old director. He didn't bother with pleasantries. The core network is down, the entire thing. It's dark. I sat up, the blankets falling away. I could feel the cold of the night air on my skin. What about OmniSec? I asked, though I already knew the answer. There was a bitter sigh on the other end of the line. They're useless. They've been following their playbook for 6 hours. They can't even get past the primary authentication wall. They don't understand the architecture. He paused, and I could hear him choosing his words carefully, aware of the open line. There's an active situation, a very sensitive one. We are completely blind. Communications are degraded. We need the system back now. Then he said the thing I suppose I'd been waiting to hear. Sarah, there's a ghost in the machine. That's what the contractors are calling it. There's a secondary security layer, a failsafe. It's asking for a biometric signature that isn't in any of the transfer documents. I almost smiled. The ghost was my signature, literally years ago. After a scare, I'd personally coded a final hidden lock, a retinal scan, linked to my profile. It was a secret handshake between me and the system. I'd built a way to make sure that the loudest sound I'd ever heard, the elevator doors closed on my old life, and I was left standing on the sidewalk, holding a box of my things, completely invisible to the building I'd dedicated a decade to. If something truly terrible happened, I would be the one to turn the key. I'd mentioned it in a passing comment during the transition, but it was clearly filed away as an anecdote, not a critical procedure. I'd never formally documented it. I suppose on some level I knew this day would come. I was calm, completely, terrifyingly calm. The anger, the resentment, the sheer injustice of the past few months had boiled away, leaving something cold and clear and hard. Paul, I said, my voice steady. Put me on speaker. I assume there are other people in the room. There was a fumbling sound. I could imagine the scene, the crisis room, panicked faces under the harsh fluorescent lights. Chad from OmniSec, probably looking pale. I'm here, Sarah. Paul said, go ahead. I took a slow breath. The system isn't down because of a hardware failure or a software bug. It's down because of a failure of judgment. You replaced a team with 30 years of institutional knowledge with a cheaper alternative. You valued a line item on a spreadsheet over the security of this nation. That secondary lock is there for a reason. It's a safeguard against exactly this scenario, against people who only know the system from a manual, being in a position to break it. I could hear a sharp intake of breath from someone on the line. I continued, I will give you the access code. I will walk you through the reboot sequence. But not before I have your word, and the word of everyone in that room, that this will not be swept under the rug. This isn't a negotiation for a consulting fee. I don't want your money. I laid out my terms. I demanded a full, formal, and public review of the outsourcing decision. I demanded that my testimony and the testimony of my former colleagues be entered into the congressional record. I demanded that the contract with OmniSec be terminated immediately, and that a plan be drafted to reestablish an in-house civil service team with the requisite expertise. This isn't about me, I said, my voice finally gaining a little edge. This is about the next system, and the one after that. This is about acknowledging that some things are too important to be entrusted to the lowest bidder. There was a long silence, then a new voice came on the line, older, heavier, with authority. It was the Deputy Undersecretary from the announcement. Ms. Evans, he said, you have my personal guarantee. A full review will be initiated at the highest level now. For the love of God, please tell us what to do. I walked them through it step by step. It was simple, really. The sequence involved a hard reset of the primary server bank, but it had to be done in a specific order, and it required a code that was derived from the date the system was first brought online. A date, I doubt anyone, but me remembered. I guided them to the retinal scanner hidden behind a panel in the server room. I described its exact location. I heard the click, the whir of the scan. A moment later, a voice, young and relieved probably. Chad said, "We're in the system, is initializing." The hum was back. I could hear it faintly over the phone. The aftermath was complicated. I was hailed as a hero in some circles, a troublemaker in others. I testified before 3 different committees. The OmniSec contract was cancelled. A new team, a mix of some of my old colleagues, and new carefully vetted civil servants, was put in place. I didn't go back. My work was done. The vindication was sweet. But it was a bitter kind of sweet. It shouldn't have taken a crisis of that magnitude to prove a point that was so obvious. The real victory wasn't that I. The first week was a fog of disbelief. I'd get up at the usual time, shower, put on a suit, and then just stand in the living room with nowhere to go. The financial anxiety crept in quickly. The mortgage, the car payment, my daughter's tuition. The severance was a temporary dam, holding back a flood. I applied for jobs, but the market was slow. The rejection emails started to pile up, each one a little paper cut on my confidence. I felt erased. Fixed the system that night. The real victory was that I forced them to look at the crack in the foundation. I made them see that you can't put a price on guardianship, that sometimes the most efficient thing you can do is to value the person who has spent a lifetime listening to the hum. The studio was my sanctuary. You know that feeling when you're surrounded by the smell of turpentine and fresh gesso, and the only sound is the scratch of charcoal on a huge sheet of paper. That was my world. I was building something piece by piece, a visual language that was entirely my own. It was all about texture, about layers. I'd build up thick impastos of paint, then sand them down, revealing the history underneath. It was messy and slow, but it felt true. That's where I met Julian. He ran a small, trendy gallery downtown. He'd come by not as a buyer, but as a fellow traveler. He'd sit on that old paint-splattered crate I used as a stool and we'd talk for hours. He wasn't just interested in the finished piece. He was fascinated by the process. He'd ask about the materials, the reason for the sanding, the meaning behind the layers. I'd bury and then excavate. He made me feel seen, understood. He said my work needed a bigger platform, and he wanted help me build it. The idea for the erosion series came from one of those conversations. It was going to be a collection of 12 large canvases, each one representing a different kind of decay, natural, emotional, societal. It was my most ambitious project. Julian was thrilled. He offered me space in his gallery to work, even helped me source some unusual materials. He was there almost every day watching the series take shape. He'd make suggestions. Sometimes, what if you used a coarser grit sandpaper here or this section feels too resolved, maybe break the surface a little more. His input felt collaborative, like he was genuinely invested in helping me realize the vision. I started to think of it as our project. But the tone began to shift so subtly, I almost missed it. When other people from the art world would visit the gallery, Julian's language changed. He'd say, "We are exploring a new technique, our concept for the series." At first I brushed it off. He was the gallery owner, it was his space, of course he felt possessive. But then it became more direct. I remember one critic visiting, and Julian said, "This piece is really the heart of what I am trying to say about memory." I felt a cold knot form in my stomach. I tried to brush it off. He's just promoting the work. I thought that's his job, but the seed of doubt was planted. The betrayal happened on a Tuesday morning. I saw the email blast from a major gallery in another city. It was an announcement for Julian's solo show. The title stopped my heart. Erosion. I clicked on the link there. They were my canvases, my colors, my textures, photographed beautifully, but undeniably mine. He had given the series a new, more pretentious statement. But the work was ripped straight from my studio. He had even used the working titles I'd scribbled in my notebooks. I felt physically ill. I scrolled through the images, each one a punch to the gut. This was my life's work, the culmination of 2 years of solitary, painstaking labor, and he was presenting it as his own brilliant debut. It was a month later, when Mark, a former colleague I trusted, called me. He sounded nervous. "You should know," he said, his voice low. "They hired someone for a new role. It's basically your old job, but they've split the responsibilities. They're paying him 20% less." He told me the name. I looked the guy up on the professional network site, right there in his current position. was the title Compliance Strategy Lead. That was my title. He was young with a generalist background. He didn't have The reviews were even worse. They called him a visionary. They praised his innovative techniques, his profound commentary. On time I read these words written about my soul, my sleepless nights, my bloody fingertips from sanding canvas. And it was like watching my own ghost receive a medal. I felt invisible, erased. I tried to fight. I sent him furious emails demanding he take it down. He responded with cold, legal-sounding language. He claimed it was a collaborative effort, and that he had every right to exhibit the work. He threatened me with a defamation suit if I went public. My lawyer was sympathetic. But clear, it's your word against his. He said you worked in his space. He has photos of himself in the studio. He can argue it was a joint authorship. It would be a long, expensive battle. And the art world loves scandal. It might just bury you deeper. I felt so powerless. I'd see his name in art magazines, see photos of him at glamorous openings, smiling next to my paintings. The despair was a physical weight. I couldn't paint. I couldn't even go into my new studio. The sight of a blank canvas made me feel sick. It was like he hadn't just stolen my art, he had stolen my ability to make it. Then about 8 months later, I got the news the National Museum of Modern Art was acquiring the central piece of the Erosion series, Vein of Memory, for their permanent collection. It was the crown jewel of the whole project. The first canvas started the announcement, was everywhere. This was the highest validation an artist could receive. And it was for my work with his name on it. The irony was so sharp it felt like a metal shard in my chest. A few weeks after that my phone rang. It was an unknown number with a city area code. I almost didn't answer. The voice on the other end was calm, professional. My name is Dr. Alicia Vance. She said, I am a senior curator at the National Museum of Modern Art. I am calling regarding the proposed acquisition of Vein of Memory by Julian Croft. My heart started hammering against my ribs. I couldn't speak. She continued, as part of our standard provenance verification, for any acquisition, especially of contemporary work, we require a certificate of authenticity from the originating artist. Mr. Croft has been delayed in providing this documentation. He's given us various explanations. Our records indicate this work was heavily associated with you prior to his solo exhibition. I was hoping you could shed some light on its creation. She was careful, diplomatic, but I could hear the suspicion in her voice. The museum was doing its due diligence, and a red flag had been raised. Julian, in his arrogance, probably never imagined an institution would dig this deep. He couldn't produce the certificate because it didn't exist with his name on it. I was the origin. I was the only one who could authenticate it. I took a deep breath. I told her the truth. I said I created Vein of Memory. I created the entire Erosion series in my studio. Julian was my gallery representative. He had access, but he did not lay a single brushstroke on those canvases. There was a pause on the other end of the line. Then she simply said, I see. We would need to see evidence, sketches, dated photographs, emails discussing the work in progress. And most importantly, we would need to see the certificate of authenticity.